A federal judge in San Francisco ordered 6 government agencies to offer fired probationary federal workers their jobs back, calling the firing process a sham. Recall that probationary workers are not people who are on probation for doing something wrong. They're people who've moved into new jobs recently. And this decision will be appealed. It could well be overturned. But for now, you got a federal judge saying they have to be hired back. I don't know if they'll be forced to begin the rehiring process before a higher court hears it or not. The other thing that happened, which is somewhat related, and I've been waiting for some president, particularly a Republican president, to bring this case. Donald Trump's asking the Supreme Court to eliminate the ability of district court judges to block his agenda. The specific case is on birthright citizenship, but this is something that drives a lot of particularly conservatives, but I think anybody who sort of thinks about America crazy, which is some district court judge in some part of the country makes a ruling and it's binding over the whole country. It's not the Supreme Court. It's not even the Court of Appeals. So the president's legal team is saying, why should some district court judge have relevance beyond that district? So you guys want to comment on either or both of those cases? You can pass, but if you'd like to, I'd like to hear from you.
I don't know enough about the courts to comment on the second one, except to say that I think Supreme Courts generally, and this one in particular, is inclined to give a lot of deference to lower courts. Yeah. And to take the attitude, no, look, we know our job and we'll do our job when it comes to us, but we're not going to interfere unnecessarily with the appellate process. On the first point, though, the firings, look, I think about all of these firings in a way together. The firing of the inspectors general, the probationary firings, the termination program or buyback program, if you will, and now some of the firings that are taking place in the executive agencies under the hand of the secretaries. To me, the real question is, what power does the president have over employment within the executive branch? And I think these are all going to go to the Supreme Court one way or another. And I think the court will largely rule in the president's favor, slightly different ways. But this is, in a way, something that really hasn't been tested at the Supreme Court. And the problem or the issue comes from Congress passing laws over time that set restrictions on the ability of the president to oversee executive branch employees. They have a certain term. They can only be fired for certain reasons. They're calling them independent, all sorts of things. And I think those are going to be tested. People like to talk about the unitary executive and invoke Dick Cheney and make it sound awful and negative. But it's about the separation of powers, right? The separation of the legislative branch from the executive. To what extent should the legislative branch be allowed to put restrictions on the day-to-day operation and personnel within the executive branch? And I think this court's going to take a very limited view of the ability of Congress to do those things.
Robbie, before you jump in, let me say 2 things. Three things. Number one, I agree with everything the senator said, with the small exception of I never predict judges, justices, or juries. I think he's right. That's probably how they'll rule, but you never know. First, I agree. Second, I don't predict. Third is, Robbie, I'm a little bit older than you, so I'm going to pass on some wisdom. Before you ever disagree with a Sununu, think not once, not twice, but think 3 times, unless it's Chris. And so if you're inclined to disagree with anything he said, take a moment and consider.
No, I'm not particularly inclined to disagree. I was just going to add that, in this question of deferring to the district judges, it's really interesting because Amy Coney Barrett has been more inclined to do that, and it is making conservatives very frustrated with her, despite being a justice with a fairly conservative track record in terms of her actual ideology. I'm seeing a lot of anger about her from people on the right because she's not agreeing rapidly enough that the Supreme Court should be making these decisions. In terms of the, what Trump and Elon is doing to get rid of federal employees, it just does always come back to me that, at this unique moment in time, they do control also Congress. They don't have a 60 majority in Congress, but they could try to do more of these things through Congress. I mean, this is what Thomas Massie and Rand Paul and a few other people have been, shouting into the void about. Like, can we actually try to reduce government employment, government spending, cancel out departments through the mechanism prescribed by the Constitution while we actually have the power to do that? And they're getting, I think, pretty frustrated that they're feeling ignored on that front. You could try to do it that way, and then you wouldn't set yourself up for some of these conflicts that are inevitably going to come through in the court, where I think you're going to find that there's broad discretion to fire employees, maybe not so much broad discretion to cancel out various funding packages without the explicit agreement of Congress. Now we're in a weird situation where sometimes Congress just doesn't actually want to do its job of legislating. Like, congressional Republicans are happy to give away their power to manage anything because they just like being on TV. Our founders didn't exactly foresee that coming to, they foresaw conflict, right, between the executive and the Congress, whereas the conflict is between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, not between the branches in and of themselves.
So on the point of spending, I think the Republican members, House and Senate, are slowly warming and actually waking up to the idea of their rescission power. So the Impoundment Act, 74 Impoundment Act, which is getting a little press, it prohibits the president, theoretically, from withholding funds. But it also sets up a prescribed legislative process for rescinding funds. And that is, the president can make a request of Congress to rescind funds. It's privileged in the Senate, so it only requires 51 votes in the Senate. It requires a straight majority in the House. My advice to them has been, do this now, do it soon, start small, pick the most indefensible thing. Mr. President, go through the process. Now, I think that maybe some legal minds in the White House are holding out hope the whole thing is ruled unconstitutional so they can just not spend any money they want. But tactically, there's a real value in doing that rescission package, showing how the process works, and winning. And one of the most important things of what's about to happen, based on your reporting with Schumer, Mark, is the House Republicans, these crazy House Republicans that did dumb things like weakening their own speaker last term, are about to realize what winning feels like. They passed this, it's only a CR, but it's their CR. And they got to see Schumer squirm, and they got to see Republicans win in both the House and the Senate. And they also saw the president weigh in. And I think, winning begets winning. And so that could have an important psychological effect in getting that House Republican caucus to work together a little bit more.
I totally agree. And I've cited you before when you're here and when you're not here. But Robbie, many years ago, Senator Sununu told me it's some ways better to have a narrow majority than a slightly bigger majority. Because if it's so narrow, there's no margin of error, then there's no groups of House members banding together saying, hey, let's tank the bill or let's threaten to tank the bill. And I think you can't take for granted that they're going to be able to raise the debt ceiling with whatever vehicle they do, that they're going to be able to pass final passage of reconciliation or anything else that they're going to try to do as a party in the House. But I totally agree with you, and it's an under-discussed point that what is about to happen is going to make them say, hey, if we stick together from Brian Fitzpatrick in the center to the Freedom Caucus on the right, do what President Trump and Speaker Johnson want, good things happen. Let's keep going. Because the next big thing up is let's avoid the biggest tax increase in history, and let's cut a bunch of taxes, and let's do a bunch of stuff on immigration and energy. And they all support that. They'll have to figure out what to do about lowering my taxes through raising the cap on the state and local thing. But anyway,
I see a fig leaf.
Yeah,
I see a fig leaf in the future.
Yes,
on salt. It's going to happen.
I agree.